the 2nd 27th Battalion was moving up the track to reinforce his depleted battalions. Footnote: for a detailed account of the fighting around Daniki, Isurava, Ilola and Eora Creek, see Cameron, The Battle for Isurava, fighting on the Kokoda track in the heart of the Owen Stanleys. At this point, Horii was determined to outflank, surround and finally destroy the Australian force thought to be taking up a position around Templeton's Crossing and Myola. Horii was now reinforced with the arrival of 2 battalions from the 41st Regiment. He had 5 battalions numbering around 2,500 men, strongly reinforced with additional combat engineers, mortar teams, artillery, and service troops of various kinds. Potts' force was now essentially a composite battalion of around 700 men, from the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions, having suffered over 30% casualties. And unlike the Japanese, they had no heavy machine guns or artillery, although they had a couple of mortars. Potts' men momentarily took up a position just north of Templeton Crossing, but were soon forced to abandon these positions due to the heavy flanking manoeuvre conducted by Horii's men. Even so, Horii was frustrated because while the Australians were withdrawing, they were not en route and were conducting a fighting retirement that was slowly but surely reducing Japanese strength. As the Japanese advanced, they got further and further from their supply base at Kokoda, and the reverse was true for the Australians as they got closer to Port Moresby. The Japanese quickly occupied what had been the Australian main supply depot at Myola. However, there to Horii's further frustration, he found that most of the supplies had been removed, and those that could not be carried out had been destroyed. Now entrenching just south of Afogi, on what would become known as Mission Ridge, located in the heart of the Owen Stanleys, Potts, now reunited with his 2nd 27th Battalion, was determined to hit the Japanese hard in a defensive battle. That said, he was fully aware that the north-south orientated ridge his brigade occupied in depth was exposed and could easily be flanked. Even so, he was determined to further bloody the Japanese before again falling back. Meanwhile, the men of the 39th Battalion had finally been relieved and were heading south down the track back to Port Moresby for well-deserved rest and reorganisation. The very next day, Horii and his battalions attacked. After 2 days of intense fighting, the Australians were forced to again withdraw. In the fighting for Mission Ridge, the 2nd 27th Battalion was cut off, and for weeks most of these men, along with elements of the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions, would remain lost in the jungle of the Owen Stanleys, some never to be seen again. After several further delaying actions, Potts and his men took up a position on Ioribaiwa Ridge, just 50 kilometres north of Port Moresby. His brigade by now numbered fewer than 300 men. Here they were reinforced with the men of the 25th Brigade. Potts went back to confer with the Australian High Command and Brigadier Kenneth Ether, who was commanding the 25th Brigade and now in charge of Maroubra Force that was strung out along the ridge. Meanwhile, Horii had finally received orders that the attack against Port Moresby was now on hold until the fighting on Guadalcanal had been decided. Horii was to take up a position north of Port Moresby and await further orders. He decided that he would establish himself with the Ioribaiwa Ridge as his base for future operations against the township. After a week of fighting, the Japanese cut through the centre-right flank of the Australian 25 Brigade, forcing the Australians to fall back to Imita Ridge. This was the last defensible ridge in the Owen Stanleys, and immediately behind lay Port Moresby. It was now that the Australian artillery for the first time commenced shelling the Japanese, who were entrenching on Ioribaiwa Ridge, and to Ether's relief, the men of the 16th Brigade had just arrived in Port Moresby and would soon be pushed up the line to reinforce the 25th Brigade. The exhausted survivors of the 21st Brigade were finally sent back down the line to rest and reorganise. By now, Ether was already conducting offensive operations, and Australian patrols were actively seeking out Japanese forces on the lower southern slopes of Ioribaiwa Ridge. Within days, and to his distress, Horii now got official word from Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo that he was to fall back across the mountains to the Japanese beachheads at Gona, Sanananda and Buna, leaving a force between Templeton's Crossing and Eora Creek to stop any Australian advance through the mountains. Unknown to the